Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As part of the White Supremacy and Supremacy Ideology Conference in the US, I will be delivering my segment of lectures today, and this one will be focusing on supremacy and its effects upon people of colour. And I intend to reference a number of sources that I've researched today to highlight particular aspects of white supremacy, its effect societally and its effect upon black communities and also other communities that black people interact with. So what is white supremacy? I think in order to understand this, we need to refer to particular structural aspects. And I want to read from a particular description that was given by the author Robin DiAngelo in her book, a very, very effective and emphatic illustrative book entitled Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And she states here regarding the structure of white supremacy: imagine a pier stretching out over the water. Viewed from above, the pier appears to simply float there. The top of the pier, the part we can see, signifies the surface. Yet while the pier seems to float effortlessly, it is of course not floating at all. It is propped up by a structure submerged under the water. The pier rests on pillars embedded on the ocean floor. In the same way the pier sits on submerged pillars that are not immediately visible, the belief structure supporting racism are hidden from our view. To topple the pier, we need to access and uproot the pillars. So the structure of white supremacy has been embedded for centuries. And this it commenced when black people became commodified as products, none other than the transatlantic slavery. So in order to build the society, we, or our forefathers, needed to be an integral part of commerce in order to enable that, in order to enact that. And the system that we reside within today, whether it be in the US, whether it be in the UK, whether it be in Europe, is premised upon structural racism, imperialism, white supremacy. You only have to look at the banks in the UK. I'm sure the same is similar in the US. These banks were built and established upon slavery. The universities that we look at in the UK and in America, when we look at the history of individuals like Cotton Mather and the religious establishments they formed and the institutions that emanated from them, they were built upon the premises of slavery. So moving on at what Robin DiAngelo says here, many today are looking at superficial aspects of racism and the fruits, the bitter fruits of racism, and not really concentrating on the foundations, that which is upholding the supremacist structure. So it's very easy to see the masses, the white masses, vehemently defending symbols of this white supremacy, this structural racism. And we see that with the Confederate statues, with the flags and the counter protests that are taking place. We had Charlottesville, and I'm talking about a US context, but we just need to look and juxtapose that on the other side of the waters at what has been taking place in the UK as well, with the graffiti and vandalism of Winston Churchill's statue. We see the other statues being toppled in Bristol and thrown into the waters on those occasions. And this is because of the symbolic elements of the same structure that exists, the structural imperial racist system which we are all residing within. And to highlight this, we need to look at what institutionalization is. What does that look like? Is there a definition for it? And from a UK perspective, after the death of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, there was a huge examination of the infrastructure that failed him subsequent to his death, how the police turned a blind eye because the suspects were white and some of them were known to the police through family relations and such like. So we then saw the McPherson report come out many years later, which was a public inquiry. And in that report, the definition of institutionalized racism came out, it emanated. And it was defined as follows. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. So it could be subtle, but there were processes in place. There were attitudes that were prevalent amongst those within the institutions, not just the police force, within education, within governmental circles. From top to bottom, this institutionalization was present. And some may say, but we've seen an advancement of black people at the time in the UK and in America. And I don't think many would argue that elements of these success stories are actually tokenism. And whereas we hear that there's a glass ceiling that many speak about, that black societies and black communities have to break through, the reality is that it's not a glass ceiling. It's a corrugated iron one. And why do I highlight that? Why do I mention that and describe it in such a way? Because when we're looking from a religious premise, and I will refer back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and what he had to face with the society at the time. The only way that this corrugated iron ceiling is going to be dismantled or penetrated is when we start stripping it away from the sides, from the structure at the sides and the foundation. In the same way we saw the Quraysh Meccan society dismantled on a premise that transcended everything that society could deal with and thwart and counter. And that's none other than Tawheed. However, this isn't the ambit of this particular lecture today. And I'm sure that some of the brothers who are contributing later on in the next few days and have contributed are going to be premising and identifying the very self-same thing, that in order to defeat white supremacy, in order to defeat institutionalized racism, in order to defeat the structure that continues to hem us in as a people, and not just us, we're talking about all individuals, all communities, that a similar movement and momentum will need to be gathered, premised and focused upon Tawheed, because that's the only thing, the only structure that can penetrate and dismantle these constrictions, these strictures that are causing us the challenges that we're facing today. Moving on, I've spoken about that structure that upholds white supremacy as described by D'Angelo, and I've given a definition of institutional racism. But we also need to look at the premise of whiteness. We need to understand what that actually is. And before going into that, I want to draw a parallel as well, because I've been watching many lectures, as some of you may have been as well, and there is that focus on Black Lives Matter. And I'm not talking about the organisation. There is an issue with the organisation, with the movement, for us as Muslims and non-Muslims as well, if we know the premise that is there. Why do I say there's an issue? Because we see many other groups and entities now. We're seeing marches in the UK for other groups who have now come under the umbrella to say that LGBT rights matter, this rights matter, that right matter, in an effort and in an attempt to diminish the focus on the issue at hand, which is Black Lives Matter, the cause, not the movement. And we as Muslims who are upholders of justice should lend our voices behind the cause. I don't mean, and I'm not advocating marching and the like, but we're talking about the cause here. And The reason I'm going off a tangent on this particular issue at the moment is because many are sitting back and saying, yes, our plight is primarily because of white supremacy. Our challenges and our marginalization is primarily because of white supremacy. But there's a flip side to that as well. We as a community, we as a people are required to take particular steps of self-development and collective development and advancement within ourselves. And that's not happening. Some are leaning on that crutch of white supremacy, blame everybody else, and not taking self-responsibility for some of the things that we are inflicting amongst our communities. And I will touch upon that very shortly. But looking at the premise of whiteness now, we've talked about institutionalization, white supremacy as a structure. We see here, again, whiteness rests upon a foundational premise. The definition of whites as the norm or standard for human and people of colour as a deviation from that norm. I'll repeat that. Whiteness rests upon a foundational premise. The definition of whites as the norm or the standard for humans and people of colour as a deviation from that norm. And that emanated from the Enlightenment period. Again, that's from imperialism, that's from colonialism. And we see that the post-colonial trends that continue in the continent of Africa are there. We see that the standards upon which those societies are trying to advance themselves and move forward since 50 years plus of independence is on that criteria of whiteness. There's they're using the same criteria that was imposed upon them to denote what is success. And this is problematic. And within that framework, we are seeing other environments and societies come into Africa, for example, and we're seeing now an economic colonization from countries like China. Why? Because the premise of colonialism that was placed by white supremacy, by Europe, by America, is still intact. And the leadership of the African countries, the African continent needs to revisit what predated colonialism, what predated the invasion and slavery that was enacted, the transatlantic slave trade that I speak of. And in going back to what preceded these invasions, these intrusions into the continent, then they can start re-establishing their own criteria, their own premise for success, which was, and we need to own this term now, black excellence. And before anyone starts accusing me of, oh, he's talking about black nationalism, I want to hasten and add one thing here. It always seems that we as black communities, Muslims, on the Sunnah, when speaking of blackness or black excellence, we have our own fellow co-religionists of the same ethnicity frowning upon us. Yet there is no issue when we hear other ethnicities lauding and speaking of Arabism, Asian culture, African culture. We are from the West, so we cannot speak to that as they do. So this is not a hue and call for or hue and cry for nationalism, but it is about an acknowledgement of self. When we look at the Sahaba, when we look at the previous Anbiya, and we look at the descriptors that were given to them, we don't promote these for fear that we are going to be accused of calling to nationalism, which is not the case. What we are calling to is a complete comprehensive context of who we are, where we are from, and what existed within the Muslim history and the annals of Muslim history. So, continuing. Being perceived as white carries more than a mere racial classification. It is a social and institutional status and identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others. So you can have the most affluent black man in society, and you can have the poorest white individual. And the infrastructure and system is more supportive of that white poor individual structurally, institutionally, than it is of that affluent black individual who some will say, in inverted commas, has made it. And that's because of the apparatus that have been in place for centuries and continues to be in place. Now, moving to the key issue, I've spoken about the structure. Remember, the subject focus is supremacy and its effect upon people of colour. And I felt it necessary to actually address what white supremacy is, what it looks like, what institutionalization is like, the premise of whiteness. Now we'll move on to the second stage, and that's the effect on people of colour, and that is at various levels. So let's look, for example, at 21st century blaxploitation. The success of black communities is premised upon what? In actuality, it's premised upon what white society has allowed black success to look like. And if we refer back to Jackie Robinson, the famous baseball player, I believe, he would not have succeeded had white society not enabled him to succeed. This is a reality. And we need to question in the avenues and boxes, should I say, for want of a better phrase, or the arenas that we are succeeding in, have they been confines that we are allowed to traverse and succeed in? And if they have, who has put them there? Because this is a very, very important point where we need to look in ourselves. So I want to say here, for example, I've mentioned the commodification of black people at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. And that was an enforced, imposed commodification. However, today we see voluntary commodification from ourselves, from our communities. And I want to read from Professor Kehendi Andrews, his book, Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. He's a British professor and, mashallah, very talented, teaching at Birmingham University in the UK. And he says this, quote, "Although with commodification of black cultural forms, you could argue that the process continues of exploiting raw materials, this time cultural, to be sold to black communities. In terms of political domination, the ghetto is controlled by a system of indirect rule, with the people elected to represent the ghetto serving as puppets for the mainstream parties." This is quite profound, but we need to consider this. So now we are having black cultural forms commodified. We have looked at what's happened, for example, and I'm talking from the UK side of the waters looking in, because the music scene from the US has profoundly influenced the UK scene. But when we look at from the late 80s and through the 90s, I converted in 1990, and I'm going to talk about rap music, hip-hop music. And those who are viewing from America will relate to this. It should resonate with them, in that we saw a very conscious movement emanate with rap music in the late 80s and the early 90s. And many of us hearing that and hearing references to Islam, whether we knew Islam or not, and 5%er and things like this, but we heard the term Islam, and there was a conscious rap. There was black cultural awareness taking place. And then we saw the strictures around this consciousness taking place from those who controlled the music industry. And then we saw it spiral and move to where it presently is now: gangster rap, nihilism, debauchery, denigration of women. And I've said this in a previous video that I've recorded. When we look among all other ethnicities, you will not find one that denigrates its own women, insults its own women with the derogatory terms like our own communities do. And I recommend that the viewers check that. Do you find it in Asian culture, how they speak about their women? No, you see them being lauded and heralded and esteemed. Do you see that in white culture, among white ethnicities? You do not. Do you see that in African culture, traditional African culture? No, you don't. Where do we see this annihilation and this nihilistic tendency against our women, who are our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, in our culture? Western black cultural norms. So I refer back to where I'm saying now, 21st century black exploitation is one of the results of this white supremacist structure that is around us. And as we all know, it sells. As we know, the videos go viral with women demeaning themselves and men being involved in that as well. This is one of the default effects, adverse effects of white supremacy. And it's a learned behavior. If we refer, and my colleagues and brothers and sisters from the US know far better than I do regarding the history of how black men and women were divided, how they were treated in animalistic formats. Now, some would say that's not taking place today. Psychologically, it is. Emotionally, it is. But some of it is self-inflicted because of the learned behavior from decades, if not centuries, in which we've ended up fulfilling stereotypes that have been placed upon us. Again, I refer to what I started with in the beginning of this particular section of black exploitation, that we are acting out those roles that have been laid ahead of us. We are fulfilling and completing compartments that have been allocated for us societally. Sports, music, entertainment, the entertainment sector. And I'm not shunning and frowning upon those who have made it in those particular sectors and are using their privilege, like Colin Kaepernick did many years ago, and now everyone is emulating that particular act of defiance from him. I'm not degrading what they've achieved. I'm not degrading some of the actors like we saw Sidney Poitier all of those years ago in the 60s, and other actors, Ruby Lee. But the point is, these are compartments that society has enabled or allowed or facilitated us to fill. And we need to be the ones defining and redefining what those avenues are. But again, we are talking about the effects of white supremacy. Moving to what Professor Kendi went on to say on this instance as well. We've talked about cultural forms being commodified voluntarily. He also stated, many of us have integrated to the point where we comfortably benefit from the fruits of imperialism. So we are also not immune to the psychosis of whiteness. And I'll go on to say I will explain shortly what the psychosis of whiteness is. But there's nothing wrong with integration to the extent that we are also conscious and self-aware of who we are, what our roles are in life, the challenges that lay ahead, and the fact that it was our forefathers and forebears upon whose shoulders we are standing upon to integrate. Assimilation should not be the key, because that means selling one's soul, basically selling your identity and believing that you are now part of that white infrastructure. As we know, the famous statement, I'm not black, I'm OJ, as OJ Simpson famously stated. I'm not black, I'm OJ. And we only have to look at when white society discarded him and turned against him. We only have to look at other famous black personalities who felt that they were part of the white infrastructure and how the white apparatus turned against them and where they were. And it was a very, very heavy and very, very sharp fall to infamy. So integration should not mean that we are now part of the system and that we've been accepted by the system because we're using the measures of the system. We have wealth, we have circles that we can traverse and engage with from white society. we are living in white neighborhoods. We only have to refer back to our illustrious leaders like Malcolm X, like Stokely Carmichael, and others talking about the black dollar, and in the UK sense, the black pound. But many of us, because of those compartments that we've moved into, we frown upon the black pound. We have made it now, so our dollar, our pound needs to be spent in the same arena, in the same avenues of where white society, the supremacist society, the institutionalized racist society spend theirs, so that we can feel validated. We no longer feel validated by self or by others, and this is all part of what the infrastructure does. This is all part of what the infrastructure that we are living amongst does. Continuing with this point of what supremacy, white supremacy, and the system does to us, let's look at the criminal justice system now before we start moving towards a conclusion. There's an element in the US culture, from what I've been researching, called prison chic. And it's an ideological phenomena because it's commoditized fads, fashions, and media that carries damaging, if not assassinating, information about black males, what they are like, the life they live, and where they belong, which ultimately points to prison. So, for example, us in the UK, we see amongst our youth now the fashion of wearing the jeans hanging down and showing the underwear outside of it. And this came from America, and we understand it came from prisons. The fact that that became fashionable, where did that originate from? How is it that within the prison system, which incarcerates a disproportionate number of black people in the US and the UK, this dress code became fashionable and not frowned upon? Mimicking these racialized and increasingly privatized incarceration realities are designer baggy saggy pants worn as essential hip-hop attire. Besides being a style, the pants symbolize wearing hand-me-downs, a necessity for the poor, and not wearing belts in prison. Prison chic is a compelling, albeit troubling phenomena, not only because it makes a profit-producing recreational spectacle of African-American incarceration, but also because it plays with and upon sociological factors that predict it. So I want to move on to the next stage now. We've talked about 21st century blaxploitation, and we've spoken about how some of us feel by assimilating, by being allowed to move into those compartments that have been facilitated by white society, by the white supremacist apparatus that we have made it, and the inflection of negativity towards our own communities. And I want to move on to another aspect now, which is dying to live. The disparities that result from the system that we are residing in at present. And we see in the UK that race and racial inequalities are now being considered significant factors behind deaths of COVID-19. Similar to what is happening in America, but obviously not on the scale of America. And we see here the revelation that people from minority groups appear to be overrepresented among the coronavirus deaths by as much as 27%. And this confirmed the worst fears of campaigners. In the US, obviously, those of my US colleagues and brothers and sisters know better, black Americans represent 13.4% of the American population, according to the US Census Bureau. But counties with a higher black population account for more than half of all COVID-19 cases and almost 60% of deaths. This is from that study. So this comes again and emanates from where? And I want to refer again to some of the research that's there. Social conditions, structural racism, and other factors elevate the risk for COVID-19 diagnoses and the deaths in black communities. And this is from scientists from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory Johns Hopkins University. They went on to state that structural factors, including healthcare access, density of households, unemployment, pervasive discrimination, and others drive these disparities, not intrinsic characteristics of black communities or individual level factors. And that last aspect is quite key, because many were saying it's because of how black people live. It's because of our lifestyles. But there is inherited poverty as there is inherited wealth. And we will look at that very, very shortly. And societally, this is an issue that has been part and parcel and fabric of the societies that we've lived in for a number of years, decades, if not centuries. The food we eat, the environments that we live in, the infrastructure that's afforded to us. When researching when Martin Luther King changed his narrative after moving to North America and seeing the slumlord conditions that were being imposed upon Americans, the rat-infested accommodations that they had no choice but to let and rent. Okay, it may not be the case or as acute as that now in some environments, but when we look at the socio-economic, when we look at the infrastructure among which black communities live by and large, and we compare them, juxtapose them with other ethnicities, white communities in particular, the disparities are enormous. When we look at the medical health that's afforded to both ethnicities, there is a huge gap, a huge wealth gap, a huge resource gap in that instance as well. And again, this is not to just point the finger only at white supremacy. There's a flip side of the coin, and we have to look at what learned behavior and what low self-esteem have we transferred and learned because of the strictures that have been around us generationally. And we have to unlearn some of those particular aspects. We have to redirect our progress and development into channels that we have chosen, not the ones that have been provided by the apparatus that we are living amongst. And as I draw to a conclusion, I mentioned inherited wealth and inherited poverty. And I want to quote here again from the research that I'm looking at here. And this is from G. Lowry, the Dynamic Theory of Racial Income Difference. And she states here, past discrimination and opportunity denial created large differences between black and white family incomes. When parents' resources affect children's ability to accumulate resources, intergenerational continuity reproduces inequality, because proportionally more black children inherit poor backgrounds, reducing their chances of high income as adults. This is a reality that we only know too well, both in the US and in the UK, and even in European, mainstream European countries, mainland European countries like France. Additionally, white families are twice as likely to receive an inheritance as black families, and that inheritance is nearly 3 times as much. Even among black families who inherit wealth, the racial wage gap is much larger compared to white families who inherit wealth. White households inherit more money and more often than black households. Being lucky enough to receive an inheritance should not be the determining factor of achieving the ever elusive American dream. And when we consider this factor, and as the discussion that is taking place in the UK at the moment continues, to highlight that reparations were given to the slave owners when slavery was abolished in the UK. Legislation was passed to give reparations that amounted to 40% of the UK's GDP at the time. 40%. And it wasn't until 2015 that these reparations were finally paid off to the descendants of the slave owners. So when we talk about inherited wealth, that continued up until 2015, where some of the wealthy families, the institutions that exist in the UK now, benefited up until 5 years ago from reparations. And this is why there's a call now for reparations for descendants of slavery. And you've got, again, and this is another condition that is imposed upon black communities, Not entirely, but it is there, where you will see detractors from within our own communities who will bang the drum of white society, who will bang the drum that contrasts with that claim that reparations should be instituted for descendants of slaves in the US and the UK. And some asked, what will that look like? Because they're thinking individuals are going to want a payment and they're just going to squander that payment. And on the squandering of the payment, there can be some legitimate concern there. Because if there's a learned behaviour of not knowing how to invest, not knowing how to build and progress, as we've seen, there have been investments in particular communities in the past and particular funds and stipends afforded, and they've been wasted because the individuals have not been educated. They have not been developed in knowing how to invest, self-development, future generations and the like. However, that should not be the be-all and end-all excuse to shut that door about discussing reparations. Reparation recompense can come in the form of funding institutions where generations can continue to get not only basic education but can progress into postgraduate education, can get master's degrees, can get PhDs, can become involved in science and all sorts and all manner of professions in that particular instance, but facilitating those progressive developments. Reparations can be put into that, having institutions that are focused upon black excellence, for example. These are some of the basic ideas that I would push out immediately if the discussion of reparations opens up and says, okay, what does that look like for black people? But it is unforgivable in the Western context, I mean, that reparations can be given to former slave traders and their descendants up until 2015, and then reparations for those whose forebears suffered at the hands of that are shut down. These conversations are shut down. Just like we hear Black Lives Matters, the cause, and that's diminished societally by others saying all lives matter. Then within the Muslim community ourselves, it's diminished further by non-black members of the community saying, what about Palestine? What about Burma and the Rohingyas? What about the Uyghurs in China? And we have to say to them, hold on a minute. You are doing something none other than what wider society has been doing to black communities for years. When the voice is raised, challenging the system, you do not recognize this and try to diminish that call for justice for our communities by conflating that cause, Black Lives Matter, the cause, not the movement, with all of these myriad other causes that black communities support anyway. Palestine, Uyghurs, Kashmir. The voices of black communities are behind those calls, but they're never saying, what about Black Lives Matter? You're calling for Uyghurs. What about Black Lives Matter? You're calling for Palestine. What about Black Lives Matter? You don't hear that, but you only hear it when the solitary clarion call is against the system and how it's repressing and continuing to repress black communities. As D'Angelo states here, and I'm drawing to conclusion now, racism, like sexism and other forms of oppression, occurs when a racial group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. This authority and control transforms individual prejudices into a far-reaching system that no longer depends on good intentions of individual actors. It becomes the default of the society and is reproduced automatically. Racism is the system. And now, in conclusion, what underlies the racism and what are we as a people up against? I'll continue with D'Angelo. She says, speaking in first person, to put it bluntly, I believe the white collective fundamentally hates blackness for what it reminds us of. That we are capable and guilty of perpetrating immeasurable harm and that our gains come through the subjugation of others. And a point to make here, which she makes, and I won't bring that quote that she highlighted, that stereotype that is placed around black people, black communities, of violence is a deflection. Because when we reflect on our history and past in the West, the level of violence that has been inflicted upon us as a people has been immeasurable and has come from white ethnicities. This is a fact historically, and we only have to refer to George Floyd and what's happened recently and the number of deaths of black individuals. And yes, the statistics point to more white people being killed at the hands of police in America than black people. Okay, that's not a surprise. But let's look at the disproportionate number of black people being killed at the hands of the police. And that's not what's being done. And when we've got some very articulate speakers, black speakers, Coleman, one of them, Coleman Hughes, this young individual. We have some professors, Professor Lowry, who I was listening to briefly today as well. And while they're speaking to an issue, there's an element of mischief that's taking place here. Because when you start talking about white people are killed in larger numbers than black people, no one will argue with that. If you want to talk about how many white people are in prison compared to black people in the UK and the US, there will be more white people. But when you talk about the ratio and the disproportionality of the incarceration of black peoples, then you start seeing the reality of what is actually taking place and how the system has industrialized our subjugation in a 21st century context, not a 15th, 16th, 17th century context. And Carol Anderson mentions here in her book, White Rage, and please, this is going to be among my concluding statements here, referring to her book. The trigger for white rage, inevitably, is black advancement. It is not the mere presence of black people that is the problem. Rather, it is blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. This is the trigger for white rage, because they hold their society and the strictures that they have placed to serve them first and foremost, exclusively. And black existence is to facilitate that, as it did with our forefathers. So black advancement, black voices, challenging their symbols of oppression, the Confederate flag, the Confederate statues, is enraging many aspects of white America, not all, but many, because they don't want to see this black advancement. So I will conclude with what I started with, and I'll reference again Meccan society at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And they didn't target the superficial physical structure and apparatus of oppression. They targeted the theological, ideological foundation, which is the essence of the foundation upon which that society existed, the existing Western societies exist, and that need to be dismantled. So whilst many are celebrating the pulling down of statues and the physical, tangible dismantling, and the voices that are being raised to challenge institutional and white supremacy, we need to look at the intangible. We need to look at the essence that is upholding and fueling the structure that we are looking at today. Then we will truly understand and target that which is affecting our communities, Muslim and non-Muslim. And as a Muslim community, as Muslim peoples, We need to lead in that with our voices. And I'll conclude on this particular issue. When I see fellow or co-religionists speaking against those of us who talk about lending a voice, about speaking out against injustice and oppression, because it's our duty to do as Ummatan Wasat, as the balanced nation, as we're told in Ayat 143 of Surah Al-Baqarah. And they frown upon this, and they bring, should I say, edicts from scholars, some of them speaking to the environment of those scholars, some of them addressing generally the context of our societies. They bring those and try to shut down any contrasting view and opinion regarding that, and then denigrate those who disagree with them on that instance. And we've got to remember one thing. While we are talking about white supremacy, we have to ensure that in not adopting that culture, in not assimilating into that culture, in not integrating to the point that we feel that we are now part of that imperialist system. I'm not saying to be aloof from it, but I'm saying not to think like OJ, that we are suddenly part of that system and we have no resonance or affinity with the communities from where we came. We've also got to remember one thing. We should not then adopt the cloak of Arabism or Asian culture, or any other culture that is not from our people. And let me be clear on what I'm saying here, because some will come and say, oh, he's speaking against Islam. Islam is Islam. Arabism is one thing. Asian culture is another thing. Black culture is another thing. But if we're going to discard our essence of being as black individuals and what that represents, to only then now speak, eschew, and support other cultures as though that is representative of the religion, then we're jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. And that's going to cause identity crises, if not for ourselves, but for our descendants, our children. And we're seeing that already, with some of them not knowing who they are, where they are, because we haven't given them that foundation. I will conclude on that. There's many areas that I could cover. However, I know that there are others more knowledgeable who will speak to the nuances that I've spoken about. And I think I've covered adequately, although in summary, how white supremacy affects and influences black communities and our self-worth, our self-dignity, and our progress. And we've got to ensure, again, we don't have a glass ceiling to break. We have a corrugated iron roof, so we need to dismantle the sides and the foundation. And in doing that, it's our deen. It is Tawheed. And not just talking Tawheed and nice slogans and words. We need to articulate, we need to actualize what Tawheed means and what it is. Because once we've actualized Tawheed in the same way that the Prophet ﷺ did and the companions around him, that actualization of Tawheed will bring the favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then we will start seeing seismic changes locally and globally, inshallah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.